Okay, I think we can begin. We can open. So to all here, many know me, not all. So first, hello to everybody. I'm Eviatar Marienberg, and I'm a faculty member at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am the director of our program, minor program called Christianity and Culture, and this talk is part of that program. I would like to welcome to this virtual event Professor Cyril Hovorun. I pronounce it correctly, I hope.
Yes.
As a courtesy to our speaker and to others, I would like to ask people generally, unless you have very good reason not to keep videos on. It's always easier and nicer to see people when you speak to them. So please do that if possible. This event is recorded. And Professor Hovorun very kindly allowed us to later post it so others can see. So we welcome our speaker. He is a Archimandrite, which is a title given to monks who are also priests in Orthodox churches, and he's professor of Ecclesiology, of International Relations, and of Ecumenism at the University College Stockholm in Sweden. Currently, he told us he's in Rome. Originally, he's from Ukraine, and he studies in Kiev, in Athens, and the UK. He served in different high positions in administration of both the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And he, in his academic career, he was a fellow or visiting professor in a variety of places, such as Yale, Columbia, Münster, Marymount, University of Alberta, Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and other places. He has published several books and articles on the topics of his expertise. Many of them were translated to various languages. I will later put a list in the chat with the list of some of his publications. So we are very honored to have him to speak to us about some of the religious and spiritual aspects of the current war in Ukraine. I want to say that as in our Christianity and culture, something that we often speak about is the importance of how religion plays in culture and religion in very different periods. It's not always contemporary, but I really wanted this year to speak about contemporary issues, and sadly, one was very quick to appear, the issue of this war, and trying to understand the religious issues that play part in this story. So the topic of this talk is called, the title is Putin's Mythology, Quasi-Religious Motivations Behind the Russian War in Ukraine. And we welcome Professor Hovorun speaking to us about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eviatar, for the words of introduction. And thank you for having me today. It's a privilege to address such a distinguished audience, and it's also a good opportunity indeed to address some issues which are pertinent to the war, to the ongoing war in Ukraine indeed, and which are pertinent also to the religious studies, I believe. Because, and hence is my first statement for my presentation, that I think this war is incomprehensible if it is studied, if it is seen just from the perspective of geopolitics, perspective of real politics, political science, and so forth. This war can be grasped somehow and understood only if it is seen from the perspective of religious studies. And in this case, I'm talking not just about theology per se, but exactly religious studies as a kind of a discipline that observes religion a bit from outside. And I'm going to explain why the religious studies are relevant to the war and why they're important to explain this war. But before I do this, let me address some other aspects of this war. It is driven by one person. Well, one person has envisaged it, one person has conceived it in his mind, and one person continues it. And until that person stops promoting this war will continue. So it depends completely on on the will of one man, and his name is Vladimir Putin. So we should not have any illusion about this war. It is really a one-man war. Of course, Putin acts in pursuing this war, in waging this war. Putin acts as a populist, and I would argue that this war has become possible because of this wave of populism, and some people identify this as a religious populism, and Putin is certainly one of them, but he's not the only one. I would argue that Putin, when he came to power, he was propelled to power to the Kremlin in 2000. He acted in a different capacity during his first 2 terms as a president. He acted in a capacity, I would call it this capacity of a container of the popular resentment. We can observe this kind of political role in other countries and political regimes, where essentially, especially in the Middle East, when the rulers in the Middle East essentially say, we are not perfect, but we contain the people underneath us, whom we rule, against them going against the West, against making terrorist acts and so forth. So essentially, they are like the enlightened absolutists. They contain they present themselves, at least, that they contain the public anger against the West, and they essentially help the West as containers of this resentment. So Putin acted in the same capacity, I believe, and he one of his messages, one of his points of his self-understanding as a political leader was that there is a danger of the communist revival in Russia, and his mission, his destiny is to essentially to contain this communist revival. After he came back to power in 2012, because there was a short pause when Dmitry Medvedev was kind of his a placeholder as a president from 2008 through 2012. So Putin came to power for his 3rd term in 2012, and I believe he started acting as a populist. So instead of containing the popular resentment, the popular kind of political agendas, he started amplifying those agendas and heading those agendas. And this eventually, I believe, has led to this war. So this is a war waged by a populist, and waged by someone who actually tries to justify his warmongering by religion. There is another aspect about Putin that I need properly to highlight, that he promotes an agenda which can be summarized by this catchphrase coined in the United States: "Make Russia great again." I think he exactly tries to do this, to make Russia great again. And of course, in this, he's not alone, as we all understand and know. And there is a bunch of other politicians and political figures who do the same, including, of course, the former president of the United States. Putin, essentially, yes, there is another parallel, I believe, between the political situation in the United States and the political situation in Russia. I believe what Putin tries to do is essentially to wage another culture war. Of course, the culture wars have been discussed extensively, especially in the American context, for obvious reasons, because the United States, is really a divided country because of the culture wars. I don't need to to preach to the choir, and I don't need to explain how they work in the United States, but I would like to emphasize one feature of the culture wars that I usually mention when I explain it to my students, that the culture wars are neither about culture nor about wars. They usually don't incur wars, but in the case of Russia, they did. They have incurred a war, and essentially the motivation for the Russians who waged this war and for Putin in kind of particularly who started this war and who continues this war, the motivation can be explained from the perspective of culture wars. For him, he fights for the values, which he calls traditional values or conservative values, against the assumed liberal values and against the assumed presumably decaying liberal West. So it's clearly an agenda and narratives of the culture wars, which Putin has instrumentalized and actually on their basis waged a real war. So this parallel between the kind of culture wars, American culture wars, and the Russian culture war, which is waged in Ukraine, is important for us to understand what underpins Putin's kind of motivation. I believe it's not really pragmatism. Some time ago, I penned a piece for a German a journal of kind of public theology forum. It's called Forum, where I argue that Putin's motivation is mostly metaphysical and not really pragmatistic. And I received a letter from a reader where he argued that he doesn't get how Putin could be non-pragmatist, because even the German security services, intelligence and analytics, they argue that Putin is a pragmatist to his very bones, they still argue that Putin is pragmatist. But I think it's impossible to explain Putin if he is seen as a pragmatist. He's a dreamer. He has dreams. He has ideas, and that is a point that I'd like to emphasize. I think that Putin is driven by really ideocracy, what can be called ideocracy. I think ideocracy can be defined as a kind of ultimate, as a very extremal form of ideological affiliation, when people are really possessed by ideas to the extent that they are ready to sacrifice to those ideas, even their best pragmatic interests. And that is, I think, what is happening in the case of Putin, because he's essentially destroying the country that he says he loves, and he is eager to sacrifice everything to this country, he says. But in fact, he sacrifices this country for the sake of his own ideas about this country. And this is really a token of ideocracy. So Putin is really ideocratic. And it's interesting that his ideocracy has prevailed over his kleptocracy, because Putin's regime was believed to be kleptocratic by many, including myself, for a long time. And we had a joke for a long time, for many years, that Putin believes in three things. Well, Putin and his clique, his circle, they believe in three things. One is money, another one is money, and guess what is the third thing? So there was a popular belief that their main purpose, their main goal is to enrich themselves, and actually they've been very successful in that. Some people believe that Putin is probably one of the richest, if not the richest person in the world. We don't know exactly the size of his wealth, but it should be very impressive. But it seems that it's not everything that he's after. And there are also ideas, and eventually in this war, it seems that his ideas prevailed over his, his economic, financial interests of himself and his circles. And we can say that his ideocracy has prevailed over his kleptocracy, therefore. Putin develops his ideas not out of scratch, not in the vacuum, so to say, but he tries to harvest his ideas from different sources, and we can identify those sources. One is history. So Putin now plays a role of a historian who demonstrates that he knows well the Russian history, and he actually continues in his life, through his work, this history. I think Putin looks at himself from the perspective of the future handbooks of the Russian history, and envisages for himself, prominent place on the pages of those handbooks. Even now, with this ongoing collapse of the Russian machinery, military machinery, and Russian statehood, I think he hasn't given on hoping for for having a prominent place on the pages of the future handbooks of the Russian history. But the kind of his historic approach, or approach as a historian, is a bit interesting. Is interesting, and it's naive, of course, and it's very amateurish. So his exposés of history, and actually it should be said that since the beginning of the invasion, the escalation of the invasion in Ukraine, Putin has given several public lectures on history. Essentially, in every time he tried to justify this war, his activities, he gave some historical insights as a historian. So he made some excursuses to the history. And now we can see that his understanding of history is quite primitive. It's quite amateurish. It's not professional. So he's not a professional historian. And his historical excursus are by someone who has no proper education and has no proper preparation for such discourses. I should probably make a footnote here and to argue that Putin's case, I think, is a good argument, a good indication why humanities are needed in the modern universities. Because Putin studied, in the period when humanities were under very strong spell of ideology in the late Soviet period. He did not get a proper humanitarian education. He was trained in law, and of course then he studied in the KGB academy, and no place offered a proper humanitarian education. So if imagine he had a proper humanitarian education, in a liberal college somewhere in the Soviet Union, late Soviet Union, probably his take on the history would have been different and probably not so much harmful as it is now. So it's just like a footnote in support of the necessity of good humanitarian education in every profession, in every university, for every professional. So let me come back to Putin's kind of historical approach. So essentially, he tries to construct a sort of history, but this history is really, as I said, amateurish, and it's interesting. One could interpret the war in Ukraine as a reconstruction of history. Those reconstruction clubs that try to reanimate, the battles of the past. They dress like Vikings or knights, and then they pretend to fight each other, all those things. I think it's something that is happening now in Ukraine from Putin's perspective. Essentially, what we observe in Ukraine is a huge stage where he tries to reconstruct the battles of the past, primarily what he calls the Great Patriotic War, or what we call the World War II. This is a victory of the Soviet Union, so they believe in this war. Well, the only difference between the Putin's war and the reconstruction kind of battles, those fake battles that the lovers of history do, is that the real blood is shed in Ukraine, and otherwise the motivation is the same. So Putin essentially acts as a reconstructor of history. And as I said, already mentioned, his reconstruction of history is non-professional. It's very shallow and very primitive and really like two-dimensional. However, what he is successful in, I believe, as a historian, is in creating a new founding myth for modern Russia. I think that is really his concern. I'm not sure that he has read, the academic literature about founding myths of Russia, of any country, because every country has had its own its own founding myth, including the United States. But certainly, well, Russia had its founding myths in the past, and Putin just continues this tradition. So those myths were created. Some of them were created by professional historians, like, for example, one of them was Nikolai Karamzin, who lived in the early 19th century, who actually created, this idea of continuation of Russia from Kiev and Rus. And this myth included Ukraine as an intrinsic part of the Russian history, without which Russia cannot exist, cannot, continue to exist as a continuator, as a successor to the Kiev and Rus, to the early medieval state that existed, on the territory of Russia. So Karamzin was a creator of this founding myth, which did not correspond exactly to the history, but at least he was a professional historian. Other thinkers and figures and philosophers in Russia who contributed to the founding myth of Russia. Not all of them were professional historians. Many of them were philosophers. Many of them were just thinkers, and Putin is one of them, certainly. So he continues this line, this tradition of creating the founding myth for Russia. And Ukraine, as I said, well, at least since Karamzin's outline of the Russian history, Ukraine has become an intrinsic part of this history. So they believe that without Ukraine, Russia just doesn't have any sense. Hence is their kind of fight for Ukraine. I should also, yes, and it's interesting that the founding myth that Putin tries to create, and this is a part of his mythology. It's an updated version of the earlier myths, and it includes some recent stages in the Russian history, including the communist period, which Putin does not reject altogether. He was, remember, I mentioned in the beginning that Putin was propelled to the power as a counterweight to the communist revival, the communist revenge. And I believe Putin still doesn't want the return of the communist ideology. Well, he developed in his early years, he developed really a feeling of frustration and maybe even hatred to the communist ideology. He doesn't want to implement it, but he certainly wants to implement some elements from the Soviet history. And he uses some models from the Soviet history for himself, including the figure of Stalin, who is like an archetype for him as a play model, so to say. So the founding myth that Putin tries to create as a kind of quasi-historian is really integral. It's about integration of different elements from the Russian past into a new modern post-Soviet Russia that Putin tries to create, to construct. It should be said that Putin's take on the Russian history is ultimately romantic. Well, contrary to to his brutality that we see, in the way how he treats people and nations, he is a romantic, and his outlook at the Russian history is romantic, and he's driven by this feeling of romanticism. So essentially, it means that he idealizes the Russian past, and he tries to recreate this idealized past in the present and in the future. And it inevitably leads to the disastrous consequences. This is one of many parallels between the evolution of the Russian thinking, political thinking, cultural thinking, and the German thinking that had led eventually to the catastrophe of the World War I and World War II, the catastrophe of Nazism and Shoah, and all the consequences of the romantic perception of the German history. Well, since you are interested also in culture, I think the Russian culture has played an important role in Putin's perception of this romantic perception of the Russian culture, and for people like Putin and his followers, for those who justify this war is a war for the exceptional role that the Russian culture has played or should play in the global history, in the global kind of culture. It's another aspect of the exceptionalism that the Russians apply to themselves. Well, in a sense, it's not very much different from the American exceptionalists. So they perceive Russia like they perceive Moscow as a kind of a city on the hill. They don't use exactly the same phrase, but they certainly have other images in the in the nomenclature of the mythology. But still, it's very close to this idea of the city on the hill. So Russia has a special mission, special role to play, in the global history. This mission comes from God, and if you perceive your mission as special, then you believe that you are forgiven many things that you do for the sake of that mission. That is an explanation for brutality of the Russians that they demonstrate in Ukraine. And the Russian culture, exceptional Russian culture, plays a particular role in this idea of exceptionalism, contributes to this self-perception of the Russians as an exceptional nation. And for example, in the beginning of September, Putin signed a decree, a kind of a law that emphasizes the importance of the Russian culture as a soft power to promote, the Kremlin's policies. And that was a very clear demonstration of the instrumentalization of culture for the purpose of the Kremlin's policies. So the conflation of Romanticism and exceptionalism, I think this conflation created this combustible mixture of ideas that exploded eventually. The ideas of exceptionalism, of course, are not new in Russia, and they go back to the Middle Ages and early modernity, when they developed this mythology of Moscow as the third Rome, that Moscow is the successor of Constantinople, which was the second Rome after the old Rome. And this perception of Moscow as the third Rome was eschatological, meaning that, and they stressed that there would be no other Rome after Moscow. So that is kind of the end of history. If you want, the monks who actually contributed to this mythology were like Fukuyamas of their time. They said, no, Moscow has become, the third Rome, and that is the end of history. There would be no other, no other Romes, and no other dramatic developments in the human history. That would be the end. So, and that was the beginning of the Russian exceptionalism, civilizational exceptionalism. That continued, of course, through the thinkers. Like, for example, in the 19th century, it became particularly sophisticated through the thinkers that identify themselves as Slavophiles. Quite a few towering culture figures contributed to this exceptionalism, including people like Dostoevsky, who was really one of the fathers of the modern Russian exceptionalism, and simultaneous of the Russian Romanticism. And the perception of Russia was and still is romantic, in the sense that they glorify, they perceive Russia as especially as kind of a kingdom of goodness, beautiful, kind, comprising all the human virtues, and the rest of the world is seen as something contrary to the Russian to the Russian civilization, what they call the Russian world. It's a combination of a kind of realistic outlook at the West. They pick up all the problems of the West. They exaggerate them, of course, and they counterpose them to what they perceive as only the good aspects of the Russian life. So the romantic perception of Russia on the one hand, and pragmatic, realistic, and sometimes pessimistic perception of the West together, they create this dynamics of of the war, essentially, when they say that we need to fight this West, this evil West. We need to purge it from its evilness. And hence is another aspect of Putin's mythology, which now gets closer to the religious studies. And I think it has a very strong and important religious underpinning. That is, I would identify it as dualistic or Manichaean. Dualism is quite a religious outlook. It's kind of one of the perennial religious outlooks. It goes back to to the prehistoric times when and the earliest religious texts actually captured the dualistic outlook, which exactly means that the world is seen in black and white, and this black and white are ontologically different. It means that there are kind of two parts of the world. One is kind of created by the good forces, another part created by the evil forces. Or if they are created by one single force, at least a part of this creature has fallen, has become unrepentantly, unchangeably, irreversibly evil, ontologically evil, and there is a kind of cosmic battle, cosmic fight between those powers. The dualistic worldview reappears in many religious traditions, and I would say that, well, practically every religion tradition has a tradition within itself, or sub-tradition, which is dualistic, including Christianity, of course. And in Christianity, it took a form of Gnosticism in the early centuries. Later on, it took the forms of like witch hunting. Nowadays, it takes the form of of suppressing gay people and the others, so to say. So those are really the manifestations of this dualistic worldview. And I would argue that Putin has this dualistic worldview, and this worldview is quite religious. So for Putin, I believe the world is also divided into black and white. And for him as a political leader, Russia is the incarnation of the cosmic goodness. It is really this the city on the hill, and the kind of the best civilization in the world. That's why he did not exaggerate when he said that there could be not a world without Russia, because it's like to say there could not be a world without goodness. For him, Russia is the incarnation of this goodness, and for him, the West is the incarnation of evilness. And he believes, well, of course, probably he does not render this belief in these terms as I'm saying now, but I assume that he perceives this difference in this way, that there is an irreconcilable difference between the good Russia and the evil West, or the evil rest of the world. And the difference is ontological. It means that it's kind of, it cannot change. By the way, I believe this is a reason to be really worried about his threats, of dropping nuclear bombs, because if you see another part of the world as unrepentable and unchangeable, irreversible, then the only way to purge it just to destroy it through destruction. That could be one of the kind of reasons to be afraid of this scenario, from the perspective of Putin's worldview, this dualistic worldview. Also, this dualistic worldview explains the crusade mentality of Putin and his generals. I would say that they can be kind of, their behavior, their strategies can be rendered as the strategies of crusaders. For them, Ukraine is their holy land, but the holy land, it is the holy land which is occupied by the infidels. So the infidels, just like for the medieval crusaders, are the modern Westerners, like the Americans, the NATO, you name them. And they came to Ukraine to purge, actually, their holy land from the infidels, from the NATO and the Westerners. That is more or less how they perceive, in the terms of crusades, their mission and what they are doing. And probably the last and probably the kind of the most important point that I would like to raise in my presentation is that yes, Putin's religiosity is dualistic, is Manichaean. Yes, it is. It is quite. One can see the roots of this religiosity, in the past. Of course, it's not correspondent to the Orthodox Christianity. I would argue that Orthodox Christianity actually is not dualistic, but at least superficially, Putin's religiosity, he presents himself as an Orthodox Christian, without, of course, knowing the Orthodox tradition and without knowing theology. And there is no one around him to instruct him properly about, this tradition. That's the problem, including the patriarch who does not tell him how to believe, in the Orthodox way. And it should be said that Putin's religiosity is quite shallow, quite superficial. And I would argue that even though it resembles, the ancient Gnostic Manichaean insights, it's pretty modern. One could and probably should understand it from the perspective of the late Soviet religiosity. And this is, I think, an important task for the students of religion, for the religious studies, to explore this phenomenon, which may give us a clue to understand Putin's kind of soul. Because late Soviet religiosity emerged out of atheistic nihilism. So remember that the Soviet state was the only established religion in the Soviet state was atheism, so to say. And the Soviet state was really anti-religious, and it persecuted the church, it pursued the secularist and radical secularist agenda. So if, say, in the West, modern kind of contemporary West, secularism was promoted as a sort of boycott against religion. In the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, communist bloc, religion was forbidden altogether. And out of this void of religion emerged something which can be identified as a late Soviet religiosity, which was very superficial, which was very superstitious. It was based on superstitions. It was almost magical. So people really believed in magic, well, real magic. I mean, I remember very well those years when, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, soon after that, there were a lot of charlatans, from religion, practicing different rituals, quasi-religious rituals, and people were buying into that. They were following, and Putin was one of them. He was just an ordinary and average late Soviet guy. And from this perspective, he essentially he embraced this late Soviet shallow magic, superficial, superstitious religion, which was dressed in the dresses of Christian orthodoxy. I mean, the tradition which is dominant in Russia. But I would argue that this was just a dress without essence, without content. And Putin's religiosity remains very, very shallow, superficial, and contrary, I would argue, contrary to the orthodoxy that he says that he represents. Essentially, what Putin is doing, he is weaponizing orthodoxy, the tradition, while he thinks that he is protecting it. But we are talking about the weaponization of the Christian tradition, and this kind of abuse of religion, of Christian orthodoxy, is very similar to the abuse of other religions in other contexts. If you take, for example, radical Islam, it's not much different. That leads to the terrorist attacks. It's very well, people or politicians or leaders, including religious leaders, who abuse Islam in this way are not very much different from Putin, who does the same to the Orthodox Christianity. So I think there is a homogeneity between the kind of radical Islam or that leads to terrorist attacks and the radical politicized orthodoxy that has led to this war. we are talking about the political orthodoxy, a term which was coined actually in Russia to describe what is happening in Russia, and it was borrowed actually from the concept of political Islam. So there is a correspondence. It's also interesting that Putin now tries to bridge, the Orthodox Christian narratives with the Islamic Muslim narratives, radical Muslim narratives. Hence, his latest iteration of his rhetoric, of his narrative, when he, for example, speaks about the war as desatanization of Ukraine and of the West, and he certainly refers not just to the image of Satan in Christianity, but also to the image of Shaitan in Islam. So he speaks in the language which is understandable also by Muslims, and he tries to weaponize Islam, to radicalize Islam in the same way as he has done to the Orthodox Christianity. And the latest point, the last point that I would like to add in the end is that what to do about this, how to deal with this. I believe that when Putin is gone, and I wish he is gone as soon as possible, not many things will change in Russia. Contrary to the belief of many that who hope, and we all hope, that Putin is gone and the war will stop, and that will be the end of the story. No, unfortunately, it will not be the end of the story. Unfortunately, Putinism will survive Putin. Putinism, as a set of ideas and a set of practices, including religious practices or quasi-religious practices, will remain, and it needs to be tackled, I believe. That's why I think, in addition, a part of winning this war and defeating Putin, we really need to take into consideration seriously defeating Putinism, which is a more complicated task. Because this task is about, it's about ideas. It's about tackling ideas. It's about deconstructing ideas. So it's mostly an intellectual effort, an intellectual task to deconstruct this Putinism, and it's something that needs to be done. And I believe that the deconstruction of Putinism cannot be done on the secular premises, just by implying secular narratives, just by eliminating religion from the equation. I firmly believe that in order to successfully tackle Putinism, religious studies need to be employed. And Putinism can be successfully and sustainably deconstructed only theologically. When theological ideas, religious ideas are applied, and that's why, well, I believe this is a huge task and a very important and responsible task for the students of religion, those who are in religious studies, to work together with the theologians and to help deconstructing Putinism. That would be my conclusion to my talk, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hovorun. Very interesting. I'm sure there are questions, but I think I will do a rude thing, and I will start first ask a question, because a little bit to continue what we discussed before. So this was interesting, and there are other things that I wonder how you connect, because we talked a little bit about them. I mean, little kind of other elephants in a way. We know that there was a big split in the Orthodox Church some years ago, and we know that there was a split between the Russian patriarchy and Ukraine. Kirill seems to be a buddy of Putin, and so the question is, in some way, the feeling you compared, you did some comparison to ex-President Trump. Trump used also religion, but I think many people would say Trump is not a religious person. Trump used evangelicals and others. There is a feeling in some places that Putin is a person that has some religious concepts, that do think about religious mission, that does, even if that there is a theology behind it. Also with Kirill, there is some kind of theology that is there. There are theological issues, there are theological debate, there are theological confrontations with Ukraine. If you can a little bit, I mean, you a little bit expand on that.
Yeah. Well, in my personal judgment, I think the Trump's religiosity is even shallower than Putin's religiosity. But in both cases, we are dealing with really an abuse of religion. Even though, well, speaking, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I believe the only God that Trump believes is himself. Probably it's not the case of Putin. He doesn't consider himself in the same narcissistic, I would say, terms as Trump does. But Putin certainly believes in his mission. He believes that his kind of personality is connected with the history of Russia. He believes in history. That is his firm belief. That is the subject of his religiosity, history, and the place of Russia in this history and the place of himself in this history. Of course, then he tries to explain to himself and to others this belief in theological terms, and that's where Orthodox Christianity comes in and helps him to to articulate his ideas. Also, the Church has helped tremendously to articulate for him his ideas, and the Church essentially, unfortunately, knew. I mean, the Church leaders, including Patriarch Kirill, knew what they were talking about, and they deliberately kind of twisted the tradition in order to make it fitting Putin's agenda. And that's how we are talking about politicization of religion, which has been incurred upon religion both by Putin and the patriarch. I would not call them bodies, actually, because each of them pursues their own agenda. Their agendas are very different. Putin's agenda is to save Russia and to save the world from itself. The patriarch's agenda, I think, is to save the church, and they really believe that the other partner may help them in achieve their own agendas. But I would not say that their agendas are completely, identical. Yes, Putin is ignorant. He's an ignoramus about religion. The patriarch is not, but the patriarch kind of plays into Putin's hands in order to assure him that his vision of his own mission is important and is really achievable. And that is, I think, a big mistake of the church, that the church has contributed to this war, to this vision, exceptionalist vision of Russia, because the church pursued its own goals, like to regain a prominent position in the Russian society, for the church. I mean, the patriarch really cared about the church, and for that reason, he actually traded theology, traded his own tradition to Putin in order to make it fitting Putin's agenda. That would be kind of my answer to this question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like I see Professor Stiers.
Yes, thank you. We are grateful that you're joining us, and we realize it's late where you are. So thanks very much for this. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about the particular role of the Ukraine itself, that territory, to Putin's religious ideology.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I didn't answer exactly Aviatar's question about the Ukrainian churches. Well, it's complicated, but this internal strife between the Ukrainian churches is not so much important for Putin, because Putin thinks really in cosmic, terms now. And well, what is happening among the Ukrainian churches is not so much important. He uses the kind of the controversy between the churches, but it's not. But for him, Ukraine per se is really it's for him like Holy Land. It's like Jerusalem, and actually, it's quite well tragic that we, the Ukrainians, often in counterposition to Moscow as the third Rome, we presented Kiev as the second Jerusalem. And we try to explain it through different narratives of the past. And essentially, as well, the tragedy is that for Putin, Kiev is a Jerusalem, is a holy land that he wants to liberate, from the infidels. And because he does believe in history, he does believe in the historical myths. And it's really a religious belief. It's not rational. It's not, it's not academic. He doesn't study history academically. He studies history as, as a faithful worshipper of history. So for him, history is sacred, and in this history, Ukraine has a central place, holds a central place. Therefore, his fear to lose Ukraine is really religious. and he tries to keep Ukraine at any price, even by killing it, still he wants to keep it, in the orbit of Russia. Yeah, so yes, the way how he perceives Ukraine, how he sees Ukraine, it has to do with, it's a part of his theology, his distorted, very perverted, but still theology.
Thank you. I see Professor Mendes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Father Cyril. I'm interested a little bit more. I'm sorry about the origins of, or the kind of influences or sources of the historical narratives with which Vladimir Putin is working, and especially with respect to religious history, what you might know about that. I remember reading the address he gave right on the eve of the war, right, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and he does everything from talk about uniatism there. He compares the modern schism in Ukraine to a new uniatism. I think he had that as in the days of the Grand Duchy, right, that now this is what's happening in Orthodoxy in Ukraine. So I am kind of curious, who do you think is in his ear, who's helping him shape at least the narrative that he might be using, if not cynically, in the religious part, then at the very least with a profound, misinformed background.
Yes, those narratives come from the church, apparently, because Putin, I doubt that Putin ever knew about unitism or whatever, and the way how he presents it, it's very clear that it comes from the church. So the church feeds him with some ideas and some images that he then uses, for in his own propaganda. And I think this is a crime that the church figures commit by feeding him with those false ideas and concepts. So and also I should say that Putin started speaking the language of the church at some point, at some stage. I remember very well, I was in Moscow at the time when this change occurred, when all of a sudden the people in the Kremlin, including Putin himself and also his other speakers on behalf of the Kremlin, they suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, it was gradual, but still it was quite rapidly gradual, started speaking the language which had been articulated by the church, the church's language, the language of Patriarch Kirill, and there was a convergence of the languages. And there is still a convergence of languages of the Kremlin and the church, but it doesn't mean that the semantics of this language is the same for the Kremlin and for the church. So we are dealing with the phenomenon of homonymity, when there is one word which can have different meanings, right? So we are talking about the language, a single language that the church and the Kremlin speak, but the semantics of that language differs, for the Kremlin and for the church. It's another question how much it is and in what points it is different. It's a subject for studies. But I would argue that they use the same words, but those words are different, quite different in their meanings.
Thank you.
Thank you. Love any others from students, other observers, other people? Some we know, some are new guests around. Yeah, okay. Caden, please. Yeah.
So what makes you believe that he actually believes his own propaganda and isn't just spewing lies? And what makes you believe that he's actually entrenched? Because in your description of the Zoom lecture, you talked about how he's a victim of his own propaganda, and I was just kind of wondering what gave you that thinking.
Yeah, yes, I do believe that he's a victim of his own propaganda. In the beginning, he was not. In the beginning, the propaganda was promoted, was propelled as a propaganda, something which was created, which was false, and people who made it knew that it was false, but they nevertheless promoted. And Putin was aware that it was wrong, and then he came to believe it eventually and we can conclude this by the way he speaks nowadays, but by the way how he articulates his arguments. It seems that he does believe what he says. And after all, the war per se is a kind of the best, the most convincing argument of that. He started this war because he came to believe what he's saying. Otherwise, you cannot explain this war. It's really suicidal for him and for for Russia. It's about the destruction of Russia, essentially. We are not going to see the Russia as it existed before. It's going to be a new entity, a new political entity, cultural entity. It's really a catastrophe of Russia, of the scale. And Putin was talking about the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's now making with his own hands the largest geopolitical catastrophe of Russia of the 21st century, which is much larger than what happened to Russia in the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he has made it possible because he came to believe his own propaganda. I don't see any other explanation.
Thank you. If others,
I have a question. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more exactly how what you described as late Soviet religiosity relates to Putin's vision. And the reason why I'm asking about this is that I'm a scholar who works on Japan, and some of the words that you use to describe kind of what was left of religious practice and as an outcome of this sort of atheistic legalism of the Soviet era, those were words that often occur if you look at modern Japan, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, as people are trying to come to terms in Japan with exactly what Japanese religion is, and they're constructing a kind of modern vision of various types of religion in Japan, for instance, Buddhism and a modern version of Buddhism. And they're trying to sort of sort out different elements that are considered acceptable and not acceptable. Right. And elements such as magic, superstition, and quasi-religion are used as terms to mark practices that are seen as sort of popular practice. Right. So in a sense, then what you're describing sounds to me as kind of established religion being dismantled. Yeah. And what is left is a sort of popular practice. And Putin, being a populist, could easily draw on certain kind of popular practices. But I'm curious if he's doing that. Is he actually doing that, or are these particular practices also constructed as anti-modern, which is what happens in the Japanese case, or is he actually using them in some kind of way? And if he does, how does he use them?
Well, Putin, after all, is an average Soviet man. He's a small man, actually, with very small mind, and he was just by chance propelled to the positions that he had. It's not a chance that, for example, his nickname in the KGB was a cigarette button, because he's short, but not just because of that. He's also, he was unable to think big. He started thinking big, and that's my hypothesis, if you want. He started thinking big under the influence of the church. So the church really inspired him to think in the cosmic, civilizational terms. But otherwise, he's a small man with very small mind, and he's smart in terms how to survive in power and to earn the wealth that he has earned. But otherwise, he's an average Soviet man, and his religiosity is an average late Soviet religiosity. Well, that's what he is. It's not that he deliberately, because he's a great thinker, he came up, with his ideas, and then he decided that it's good to use those ideas in order to, to be received by the Russian people. No, it's what he is, and he sees religion in these terms. He doesn't see beyond that when he is, looking at religion. So yes, he's rather a product. He's not really a producer of this religiosity. He's just a mere product of this religiosity, I would say.
I see no other question for now. I would like to thank you for that. It was very fascinating, the comparison. We all hope this will end eventually, this horrible war. We hope all it will end in not too dramatic way for all sides. And when things like this, and if Putin, I'm not sure, you tell me if it's wrong that he thinks about himself or some other thing, or even some kind of a messiah or someone that brings some, as we know, when religion prophecies and messiahs fail, a new theology has to be created. So I'm not, if you can imagine what he would say, or if there will be no others, what the Russian Orthodox Church might say, how they might explain. Maybe already some of them, maybe it's dangerous to explain now, to say that things do not work as well. How, if you have things like this, and after that I see another person questioning after that, but if you can think about what will happen next in religiously speaking.
Yes, it's a very important question. Thank you for it, and I think it is something that I'm thinking constantly on, because we are living through in the times of crisis for theology, for the church, and just like after the World War II, a new theology emerged to overcome the shortcomings of the previous theology, which had supported, the Nazi and the fascism and so forth. And this new theology was importantly branded as the theology after Auschwitz. I think we need some kind of new theology after, we can call it theology after Bucha, or you name the atrocities that have been committed, in Ukraine, that need this theology. This theology needs to be to revisit the roots of the tradition that has been abused by Putin and his confederates. And in a sense, I believe this tradition has to be rescued on the basis of its own sources, of this tradition as such. And I think there is an internal potentiality in the Orthodox tradition to give arguments, give ideas, to produce ideas to overcome this abuse of religion, this ideologization, the politicization of religion that Putin has kind of endorsed, and it's happening in the Russian Church. So yes, we need to revise what has happened. We need really to consider seriously what has happened to the Russian psyche, to the Russian religion, to the Russian religiosity, to the Orthodox religiosity. And I hope that through common efforts, we will be able to produce something like the theology after Auschwitz in the aftermath of this war.
Thank you. That's pretty dramatic, will be. Thank you. I have a question from Ariadne Alvarez.
So similar to how Putin uses the religion to justify his actions, is there any way he's also putting that onto the people himself? For example, like let's say maybe in a mass he's explaining and using his reasoning, and maybe it'll justify what he does and what he thinks to the people. Is there any way he's putting his religious ideas into them to justify the war?
Yes, certainly so. Like, for example, the recent justification. Well, the justification for this war is changing all the time. He started this war with one set of justifications and continues with very different sets of justifications. So it's very, it's very fluctuable. It's very unstable. The latest iteration of the justifications for this war included, as I mentioned, desatanization. So he started with the denazification of Ukraine, and now he's speaking about desatanization of Ukraine, which is a very religious term, right? And as I said, he tries to actually trigger the kind of religious sentiment in both the Orthodox and the Muslim parts of the Russian population, because for the Muslims it's important, this kind of they perceive the West as a great shaitan, or America particularly as a great shaitan, and essentially Putin invokes those ideas among the Muslim population. Actually, it resonates with many Muslims, as it does resonate with the Orthodox population in Russia. So he makes those references specifically in order to trigger religious sentiment or resentment.
Thank you. There are I don't see other questions. If you want to have some words to conclude, or we can close here, and thank you for that.
I may just conclude with, a sort of appeal, invitation. Let us work together, in deconstructing this vicious ideology. I believe it is a vicious ideology, and I believe only with the efforts of those who know religion, and I think this can be possible. Secular ideas will not be enough for that.
Thank you very much. I think we all really appreciate your talk and late night in Rome. And we wish you all and Ukraine and Russians as well a peaceful, hopefully peaceful end of this tragedy. And that secular, religious, and forces and everybody will help, hopefully, to end this. So thank you all. Thank you, Professor Hovorun. Thank you, all the participants, and good evening or night to all wherever you are. Thank you.
Yeah, goodbye. Take care.